I was probably smoking, but
Yeah. Oh, you were smoking something. It looked like a bong, I think.
no, no, I would never do that.
Oh,
But
okay.
yeah, no, I don't do that actually. Pot makes me throw up, so
Oh, okay. Well,
it's
that's
for some people it helps their nausea. For others, it
mhm.
yeah makes you violently ill. So
All right. Thanks for joining me, everyone. Charles Moscowitz, every afternoon at 12 noon, Monday through Friday, Eastern Standard Time, live on YouTube and other subscribing platforms. Karen Straughan is with us, Gender Society analyst, YouTube host, author. She's criticizing Kumail Nanjiani's article, Traditional Masculinity is a Disease, and where she trashes male Trump supporters. Karen, thanks for joining me.
thank you for having me, Kumail Nanjiani. Yeah, he. I don't know if you recognize him. I don't know if you ever watched the series Silicon Valley, but he
No,
played the developer Dinesh on that, and I found that series really hilarious. But
I'll have to check it
apparently,
out.
he's an anti-masculinity activist and
Hmm.
has a history of making statements like that. And he said this about Trump voters just recently, that the men who voted for Trump, uh, that there's something pathologically wrong with them because they apparently engage in traditional masculinity. So
Oh, interesting
yeah.
case. And by the way, just for the record, the one category that Trump did not did not expand his base in was white men. I mean,
Yes,
everywhere,
exactly.
let's putting that aside though. I mean, his thesis is that there is something wrong with traditional notions of masculinity. And this is something that, Karen, I'm hearing a lot of people say, especially younger people, millennials, high school, college kids, that somehow not only is masculinity, traditional masculinity, toxic for society, but it's also toxic for men. What do
Oh,
you make of it?
I think that there is a point to a lot of this discussion, right? That there are certain aspects of being a man, that sort of you're too tough to go to the doctor when you're hurt or you're sick, and things like
Mhm.
that can actually be detrimental to men themselves. Um, Refusing to talk about your feelings, things like that. But those are also when they're actually when those traits express in a healthy way, um, that you are the person that people can lean on when a loved one dies, and there are things that need to be done. There are things that need to actually happen, and somebody needs to take care of it. And if you're the one who's strong enough, at least in the short term, to hold it together while everybody else is losing their minds around you, then that's a valuable trait to have, right? So as far as I'm concerned, like traditional masculinity, there's plenty good about it. And that's going back, if you want to talk traditional, I mean, like go back and read the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's like a 4,500-year-old text. It's our oldest written text. Um, and it basically shows this arrogant, selfish, violent form of masculinity in Emperor Gilgamesh or Gilgamesh, and he becomes the healthy version of what it is to be a man through the course of that epic.
Mhm.
So what you see is, I think we've seen that a lot of these traits, that when they are expressed or channeled in towards healthy and productive goals, that we're defining them not as morally neutral, we're defining them as 100% negative. So
Right. In other words, we can take a look at the situation and not throw everything out, and
right.
maybe take a look at some of the detrimental elements of it. Historically, I think goes back to Roman times, where the Romans tended to view emotional people, emotionalism, as a feminine trait, and that the male was supposed to be very stoic and kind of rock solid, never to show public emotion, not to cry, of course. and that this sort of began the what we view in the West as the demarcation between men and women in terms of how they're supposed to behave.
I think, yeah. Well, I think there's always been a demarcation between men and women. But, there's a lot of biology at the heart of this as well, right? So if you're talking about crying, emotional crying, um, well, you look at the situation with children, both boys and girls, uh, before puberty, easily shed emotional tears, right?
Sure.
And as young women grow into adulthood, they maintain that ability, that biological, that physiological ability. But as men grow into adulthood, what happens is their tear ducts and their tear glands completely change, right? So their tear glands become less productive, smaller and less productive, and their tear ducts become wider. So not only do they produce fewer tears, but they actually need to build more of them up before they'll actually spill from the eyes and onto the cheeks, right? So women are biologically, they evolved to be criers, and men, for whatever reason, and I think we can probably figure it out, the roles that men had to play
Right.
throughout history, going all the way back to hunter-gatherer societies, right? Crying is not necessarily that beneficial for them in all circumstances. And then you even have women's tears are their chemical weapons. What they contain.
Right. No, I get it. Sure.
They contain pheromones or hormones, oxytocin, and I forget which is the other one. But one of these hormones, when males are exposed to it, it causes, when people are exposed to it through a nasal spray, right? They become more trusting, right? They become more, they're more likely to believe you when you give them a sales pitch. And another chemical in women's emotional tears, this is just in emotional tears, reduces men's libido and their testosterone levels, like immediately upon being exposed to it. Right. So, I mean, and men their emotional tears don't have any of those lovely chemical weapons in them.
No.
So.
I mean, I suppose that you could say that it's a form of currency for women, maybe in the same way that cleavage is a form of currency for women. But putting that aside, the the question of you bring this up as a biological issue, whereas the kind of the more socialistic left likes to view it as a conditional thing, that somehow society conditions young boys not to cry, and that this is all sort of a something imposed externally. And I think that in a way is the entire thesis of male masculinity, that somehow it's something that was made up, it was manufactured.
Yeah, that's really the
by
thing.
society.
That's really the thing, that they think it's imposed on males by outside cultural forces, rather than something that, I mean, yes, culture does have something to do with it, but biology and culture are like sort of a feedback loop, right? And I think culture tends to be an emergent property of sort of the environmental conditions that you have to contend with, right? So back in the hunter-gatherer times, men had to behave like men. They had to be useful in those ways. Now, not so much, right? So we're relaxing those kinds of things now. And most of what masculinity has evolved to be, whether it's culturally or biologically, has essentially been what are the empty spots on women's spreadsheets? And you're the one, if you can fill those spots, right, then you're going to get a shot at the brass ring of getting a mate and having some children, right? And so even if you look at the feminist idea of it's the patriarchy and men are in charge, and that's why, and so it's men who decide what men are going to be, right? Well, you look at it, and women have an enormous influence on how men behave, and on the cultural attitudes that men choose to embrace. Or, Dr. Warren Farrell, I think he said one time, if women just one day en masse decided that the sexiest thing about men was their ability to walk on their hands, guess who would all be taking lessons on how to walk on your hands? It would,
Right.
men would be doing that. Right. So, I mean, it's a very, very interlocking feedback loop. And, it's to essentially say, well, it's none of it's biological, it's all social and cultural, and that society and culture are dictated by men because men happen to be overrepresented in top areas of power and status. That's really just it's overly simplistic. It completely lets women abdicate any kind of responsibility or agency in terms of enforcing these things. If you've ever seen a woman hit on a man and him reject her and then her say, "What are you, gay?" Right? That's a woman enforcing masculine norms, right? If you're not ready for sex with an attractive woman, ready to just do it on a moment's on very brief acquaintance, like I expect men to be, right? Then you must be gay. And so, I mean, it's just like, or if you're not attracted to me as a woman, you must be gay. They virgin shaming, all kinds of things like that.
Yeah, no, I get it. I mean, it's sort of like women, in other words, in an indirect way, are creating and are dictating the way men are supposed to behave in order to
I think it's not necessarily indirect. I think it's quite direct.
Well, the examples you give are
yeah,
that's for sure.
I think, absolutely, it's quite direct. Women know what they want in a partner. Right. Men will try to be that.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. And, look, traditionally in Western religion, probably Eastern religion, and this is expressed maybe in more mystical elements, I would certainly of Judaism, and I think also other Western religions, you have that men and women, and this is backed by biology, that men and women are physically different, which is obvious, and yet they're physically opposite and they're built to complement each other. And of course, the ultimate expression of that is the sexual act. And that as such, women and men have different properties. It doesn't mean that we're different mentally or spiritually. I mean, the Bible says that God created men and women in his image. It doesn't just say men. So, we're equal in that sense, and we're certainly equal intellectually. But yet the differences are, according to traditional views, that because women are built the way they are, that being that they are built to bear children and become pregnant, that they are the more nurturing, the more moral partner, that they are because out of necessity, because they need to protect themselves and their children. Whereas men are less so, but yet men are more aggressive. It's the man who goes out and fights the wars and defends the family and builds the skyscraper and, invents the new structures in order to advance civilization. Yeah. And that these two factors come together in the form of the family and they balance each other, and one cannot really function properly without the other. So you have the most important relationship known to nature, and that is the relationship between a man and a woman.
Agreed. And I wouldn't necessarily call women more moral, but I would say that okay. And I wouldn't even say that they are equal or the same mentally in terms of their intellect. I think that in terms of raw IQ scores and things like that, we're pretty much even Steven, right, but there are different differences in the brain that actually affect how men and women process information. There's even differences in the visual cortex and in the eyes that make it, and this may be why men are better at, hockey. The women's hockey team in Canada, they spar with 15-year-old boys, right? And they usually lose, right? And it's because even their visual acuity is different. Men have less peripheral vision, and their eyes are geared, and their visual cortex is geared more toward tracking motion, right? Which would be good if you're a hunter, right? Whereas women, they have wider peripheral vision, because if you're sort of back at the cave and on guard and watching your children play and keeping an eye on everything, right, that's what you need. And you're not going to be the one who's going to be fending off necessarily the leopards or the wolves or whatever. That's for the young men who stay home, the adolescent boys who are there guarding the settlement while the older men go out and hunt. So, and there's this hormone cycle that they actually discovered among a hunter-gatherer tribe called the Tsimane in Bolivia, right? And they followed these men, maybe one man or two men in as partners, right? Go out, spend 8 hours trying to find something to shoot, and walking through the forest, and then they bring it home to their family. And what they found when they tested the saliva for the testosterone and all the other hormones throughout the day was that when those men left the house and they were kind of moody and restless and eager to leave, right? They wanted to get out of there and go out together. Throughout the day, their testosterone was quite low, right? But as soon as they brought down an animal, right, they had this huge rewarding rush of testosterone, which gives you something called the victory effect. It's like, he shoots, he scores, right?
Sure.
But at the same time, they got a huge hit of oxytocin, which then brings, it's called the love drug or the bonding hormone, right? Which brings to the front of their mind, right, their wife and their family back at home, the people that they love, so that it's essentially hormonally compelling them to not sit down together exhausted and eat the whole thing themselves, but to lug this heavy thing home. And then the testosterone helps them share it equitably between the two households, because testosterone promotes fairness in bargaining and the reduction of this telling of self-serving lies and all kinds of good things like that, right? So you actually have, and the testosterone helps repair the tired muscles and gives them a boost of energy to get that animal home, right? So I mean, like, and then after a couple of days, their testosterone goes down again, and they start getting moody, and they start getting restless, and they start wanting to go back out, right? And they need to get away. And so when you actually look at that in the context of even modern employment, right, and things like maternity leave and paternity leave, this is, I think, why even in Sweden, they have equal amounts of parental leave for both fathers and mothers. But most men transfer all of the weeks that they're allowed to their wives, because they get restless, and they actually had to make mandatory a certain amount of paternity leave. You use it or you lose it. You can't transfer that amount to your wife in order to encourage men to stay home longer than they otherwise would, right? Because they have this itch to get out and earn or hunt or whatever, and bring that home, right? And that would certainly be the case after you have just added another mouth to feed, right? So
right. No, I have the interesting theory, and I think it proves out in nature to be the case. When you talk about testosterone and that sort of thing, for some reason it makes me think of Donald Trump, right? Right, the ultimate example of the alpha male, and that one of the reasons why our modern left-wing thinkers and activists despise Trump is for that. They want to have this kind of like fuzzy, he goes out, he fights the fight, then he goes back out and fights another one, and he's sort of seems to thrive on the combat, and he doesn't mind standing up and having people throw crap at him, and he just sort of keeps growing and keeps going. And
he's very high energy, and he's got a lot of calluses.
Yeah, and it doesn't seem to, he gets a little testy for sure, but he knows how to get out there and fight the good fight. It's a very traditional male view,
Mhm.
And it's one that really rankles. I think it has a lot to do with this irrational, completely in-code hatred that some people have for him.
Well, you know,
Yeah.
what I found interesting is that a lot of the people who uh, decided immediately when he decided he was going to run that they detest him, they despise him. He's the worst of the worst. He's a horrible human being. He's a racist. He's a sexist. He's everything, right? A lot of these people are some of the same people who, were wanting to be around him when he was a celebrity, right?
Oh,
And
that was whole thing was interesting because calling him, he was a hero among Black people for decades,
yeah,
getting awards and going to ceremonies and bringing them
oh,
in. And he's
he
the
was
first.
a fixture in rap music too.
Yeah, he was the first person to integrate his Mar-a-Lago, club, and everybody hated him over there for that. And all of a sudden, the minute he stepped on the elevator, he becomes a white supremacist and a racist. The
Yeah,
whole
it's
thing
very
was,
strange.
was very contrived. But I guess that the only one area where maybe I could push back a bit is the fact that society and individuality has advanced. We are
Mhm.
no longer in the times of Gilgamesh and
Yep.
Hammurabi. We now are in a time where women can do all of these things. They can have high-powered careers. They can go out and fight the wars. Look at like Margaret Thatcher. We just saw her in the Crown. She was the only one in the room that wanted to go to war at the Falklands. Everybody else was willing to surrender. Women can take those sorts of leadership positions and do these sorts of jobs. And I think that, in this day and age, things maybe have changed a bit, right?
They have, and this is why what used to be described as toxic masculinity is part of the reason why is now considered to be traditional masculinity, right? Because uh, over time in academia, over the several decades, right, they've had these tools called the conformity to masculine norms inventories. They have conformity to feminine norms inventories as well,
Right.
right? And this is just a list of the expectations society places on men and on women. Um, and as women have embraced more and more of what would be seen as, or even been pushed into more and more, what would be seen as traditional male expectations, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, so things like breadwinning and ambition and being a careerist and being sexually liberated, even. Um, what you're seeing is all of what were considered maybe 50 or 100 or 1,000 years ago to be masculine virtues like honor and courage and stoicism and uh, ambition and things like that, right? That are all fairly morally neutral, often very positive, right? Those have been pulled out of the inventory because, well, that applies to women too. And I'll give you an example. The latest conformity to masculine norms inventory, which was developed by an academic called Mahalik, um, he sat down with a couple of focus groups of his grad students. The minority of them were male, and they were deciding on what the masculine norms are for the dominant males in the culture, which would be white males, straight white males, and white males were very, very poorly represented in these focus groups, right? But
Mm-hmm.
um, they chose as one of their items was Playboy. Okay, so promiscuity, essentially having sex with a lot of women,
Mm-hmm.
right? And they based it on a book uh, that explored the ways that men love women. And they actually surveyed a bunch of men and they said, out of these four things, what is your primary mode of loving women? Is it breadwinner? Is it nurturer? Is it faithful partner? Or is it playboy? And only 2% of men said that playboy was their dominant mode of loving women, right?
Right.
But of course, women are expected to be nurturers. Women are increasingly expected to be breadwinners. Women are expected to be faithful partners, right? As well. So you can't call those masculine norms. The only masculine norm out of the bunch is playboy. So that's what made the list,
Huh.
right? Yeah,
Interesting.
success as well. Success used to be a masculine norm, and then they ended up, women are increasingly feeling pressure to succeed. So now it's not a masculine norm. So now in its place is something called the primacy of work, right? So workaholism is a masculine norm.
Interesting. But I mean, I suppose, you mentioned Playboy. I think that was part of an agenda, frankly, to um, turn men into boys, basically. That everything, the ultimate virtue was pleasure, sensual pleasure. That whatever goes is good, and if it feels good, go for it. And that women became objects. And I think that I mean, in a broad sense, it goes to Sigmund Freud's concept of polymorphous perversity, which he held up as the ultimate virtue. Do
Hmm.
anything you want to do at any time with any person, with any group of people, and that this is the ultimate virtue. And to suggest otherwise means that there's something wrong with you mentally. I mean, you got emotional problems.
Well,
And
that's just foolish, because
right, of
we
course.
know that our capacity to bond is actually detrimentally, to form a long-term bond is detrimentally affected, um, the more sexual partners we have, right? It just
Right.
kind of goes down and down and down. It's sort of like wearing out the system. Certainly our bodies don't necessarily wear out, and all of that, in terms of the physical act, but the hormones that actually bring people together and make them form those long-term connections, those are kind of watered down the more partners that you have.
Oh yeah. And basically it makes people more docile and less, independent and sovereign, and it compromises and damages the traditional family.
Mhm.
And it has a lot of other agendas attached to it. Um, now in today's culture, we have the phenomena of androgyny and the blurring of the lines between men and women as held up as the new virtue. Now you can literally have someone decide whether they're a man or a woman on the same day.
Mhm.
Somebody can make this decision allegedly. I mean, of course, biology and science says no, but people think they can say that they're halfway there, halfway here, halfway this, halfway that, and make up their mind 100 times in a day. And to question that is seen increasingly as taboo.
Yes,
What do
absolutely.
you make of that?
I think trans people, there's an argument to be made that they exist, that there is a
Sure.
certain there's a certain biological difference in their brains that causes them to feel like they're in the wrong body. That's, I think, been confirmed scientifically. But what's going on right now is more, I would say, trans-trender kind of thing. It's really, and it's this free for all. Throw out the rule book. And what really bothers me is the idea of discussing this or teaching this to young children. I mean, young children, in kindergarten and, grade 1 and 2, right? They need to be tethered to some kind of reality, because they're still forming their idea about the world. And if you give them, if you essentially tell them that there's no solid ground to stand on, right? Then they're going to feel like like anything is a possibility, when in reality, um, a lot of these kids. I mean, I was a tomboy. I still am a tomboy,
Mhm.
right? And tomboys were just fine back in the day.
Right.
Nobody thought that because I was a tomboy, I wasn't a girl.
Right.
And I grew up and I went through puberty and I got married and I had my 3 kids, and I have a lovely relationship with for 10 years now with the man that I'm with now. And so I mean, I'm looking at it and I'm thinking, well, if I was 5 or 6 years old, right, and some adult in a position of trust had approached me and said, "Do you think that maybe you aren't really a girl? Did you know that you can
Mhm.
be a boy?"
Oh my
Right?
God, that's
I
insane.
don't know what my life would look like now,
Yeah.
right? Because I might have said, well, come to think of it, that now that that's been presented to me as a possibility, maybe I am actually a boy, right? And so, like we're playing with fire here. particularly with children. I'm fine if you're an adult, do what you want, right? But
Right. I mean, if you want to go that way, but the thing is that it's bad science because then they're going to give children drugs that we don't even know the long-term effects of. You have people mutilating themselves. I mean,
yeah,
to me, it's. I mean, I don't hope I don't get in trouble for this, and I know that I don't want to get pulled down off of YouTube. But look, ultimately, every person is either male or female. It's just that
yes,
simple. I know that people say, well, what about hermaphrodites?
intersex,
Even
yeah,
even so, they're still ultimately either a male or a female, and the proof of that is that if they were both, then you could say that they could inseminate themselves and impregnate themselves, and that's not possible scientifically. Either they have a dominant male or dominant female aspect. The other, it's not that they may not have some biological issues. That's extremely rare, and if that's the case, then that should be respected. But I think traditionally in cases like that, the parents will view the child and see which tendency is the more dominant and then go with that tendency, which I think is probably the moral thing to do, because you want to have that child identify as either male or female, depending upon which is the stronger element. And that can be determined. You know,
yes.
it's not an unknown aspect.
Yeah, well, they in Sweden or Norway rather, they when they have a baby born with ambiguous genitalia, they don't know. Um, what they do is when the baby starts to become ambulatory, so starts to crawl, starts to be able to get around on their own, they stick the baby in a room with a doctor who's making, timing things and stuff, and a whole bunch of toys, gender neutral toys like Etch a Sketch and blocks, um, and highly gendered toys like dolls and trucks and things like that. And that's essentially by looking at what toys those babies show the most interest in, they can sort of come to some kind of determination as to which way they're leaning, right? They let the baby decide because the baby's the only one who really can decide. But I mean, you look at the research in monkeys and in chimpanzees in terms of how they play as babies and juveniles. It's the same thing, right? It's the same thing. If you give a bunch of rhesus monkeys choice of stuffed animals or trucks, right? The
Mm-hmm.
females will choose the stuffed animals, and the males, and they'll play with the trucks a little bit. The males, they go straight for the trucks. They don't want anything to do with the dolls unless what they're doing with the dolls is ripping them apart because it's
Right.
and stick carrying behaviors, because chimpanzees use sticks as toys, right? They carry them, the females split their time mostly evenly between carrying their stick like it's a baby and carrying it like it's a tool or a weapon. And the males, it's never a baby. It's always a tool or a weapon,
Yeah.
right? So you look at all of these commonalities across species, and you have to realize that this is
It's
baked
part of
into
who
us.
we are.
Yeah.
And this, it goes to what I was saying about traditional religions viewing men and women as each, while equal, having different aspects that have to do with the biological fact that women get pregnant and men impregnate women,
Mhm.
and that this has consequences. That doesn't mean that in this day and age, women and men can't do different things, because we're way freer
Yes.
and more able to determine our own personal destinies. I mean, I get that. That's also a fact of life. But
Oh,
nevertheless, there is something to be said for upholding these conventional values in a context of freedom.
yes. Well, and I think too, I mean, like a lot of when you start talking about these things, people tend to assume you're talking prescriptively, like you want every single human being in society to conform to, all the women to be like the same kind of women and all the men to be the same kind of men. And that's just not the case. These are descriptive, which means that to know all these things is to be able to tell when there is some unequal outcome, such as in Congress, or at the top of Fortune 500 companies, things like that, in terms of computer science and programming and all of that. right? To determine whether that's because of an injustice or whether it's just people making the choices that work for them, that that they're exercising their preferences the way they want. And there was a book called Sex as a Political Variable that actually went back through a bunch of US elections at multiple levels, all the way back to like 1970 or something like that. And they found that when women run, and doesn't matter whether they're running as a challenger against a male incumbent, or whether they're running as an incumbent with a male challenger, or whether they're running from an empty seat against a man, right? They found that there was no statistically significant difference in women's likelihood of being elected, right? The reason there aren't more women in Congress is because fewer women run for Congress. That's just how it is. And when you look at the number of women who have run for president, right? And then you go and you look across, the slate of all of the presidents, you can't necessarily, that statistical difference is still within the margin of error. And you can find all kinds of reasons why Hillary didn't win. Hillary didn't win because she was probably the most unlikable candidate on the face of the earth,
Right.
second only to Kamala Harris.
Yeah, she didn't win for political reasons. If anything,
No.
her gender probably helped her do better than she might have otherwise done.
Yeah, I think people got a little bit. They were uneasy because women do have this card that they can play, the sexism card, and that sort of, it's like a get out of criticism free card. And people don't want to have leaders that they can't criticize.
Yeah. Plus, Hillary knew how to use the card of the toxic tears.
Oh yeah,
early on. And I remember just the establishment liberal media was pushing and pushing and pushing the idea we have to have a woman here and a black person there and a gay person here. And all of a sudden, when McCain picked Sarah Palin, everything turned around 180 degrees. She was one of the most hated, most vilified. I don't think anyone's been more hated until Trump.
Yeah.
And not only that, but the kind of hatred I remember that poured out against her was the worst kind of sexism. Portrayals of her as this witch and as this stupid person, and just the most vile images of women, all by liberals. This is all like trotting out this kind of thing.
If it weren't for double standards, they wouldn't have any standards at all.
So Karen, where can people check you out in terms of your YouTube channel or any other information you'd like to share?
YouTube channel is Girl Writes What, or you can just, it's actually, my channel name is now Karen Straughan. And you can't find me on Twitter anymore. I annoyed the wrong male feminist, and I got the boot for life. And so you can find me on Parler.
Parler's great.
At Girl Writes What. And I do have a blog. It's called, can I use a cuss word?
Go right ahead.
owningyourshit.blogspot.com.
Okay.
So, and that's pretty much where you'll find me. I haven't put out too many videos recently, but I'm all over the internet, commenting in interesting places and stirring up trouble, getting into arguments.
And by the way, I should mention that we all have to do a little alternative media now if we want to stay in this business. And for that reason, my program here at YouTube is also carried on Rumble and on Minds.
There you go.
Not to mention on Podomatic, I download it so that it's heard on iTunes, iHeart, Spotify, and all these others. So, in a way to get by in this day and age of censorship and media blackout, you have to diversify your media. So,
and I would also recommend to people, if you want to visit my channel, do it through your YouTube account. Don't go in as a user with no account, because then you won't see a whole bunch of my videos because they've been age restricted. So, make an account so that you can say that you're 18, so that they'll actually show you those videos, because otherwise they're just invisible on my channel. So,
well, I can't wait to check that out, and I urge people to go there. And Karen, listen, thanks so much for joining me, as always.